All right, welcome back. Part 3 for this week. Sorry, it's a lot of talking at you this week, but again, there's a lot of reading, and these concepts can be a bit confusing and tricky to understand. So I think it's worthwhile for me to go through the information in a little more detail because these biochemical pathways are not necessarily the most intuitive of concepts to work on and work with. So part 3 of this lecture is basically all of chapter 5, which talks about photosynthesis. And chapter 4 really is talking about these breakdown processes, how organisms take sugars and break them down into usable energy for the cell. All eukaryotic organisms do this. If you have mitochondria, you're running through this pathway we just got done talking about. This glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. This part of the lecture, so chapter 5, is about the other side of the equation where we're not taking sugars and breaking them down, but we're taking energy and building those sugars. And we as heterotrophic organisms, humans, we don't get to do this. Only photosynthetic organisms get to utilize sunlight energy and build their sugars. And this is really what that chapter is about. We're going to start talking about understanding that we're using the sun as the energy source for building these sugars with autotrophic organisms. These autotrophic organisms can be full plants, they can be mosses, they can be microscopic algae. Lots of different organisms utilize photosynthesis, but what they all have in common is the same, or at least similar, chemical pathway whereby they're using energy from the sun and converting it into usable sugars. These organisms that can do this are called autotrophic organisms. They make their own food, and if they're using the sun, they're called photoautotrophs. There are chemoautotrophs, but those are found only pretty much in deep sea hydrothermal vents where they don't get any sunlight. They just simply have a different biochemical pathway. But since this is plant biology, we're going to talk about photoautotrophs, organisms that use the sun to build their own energy reserves. Without photoautotrophs, we would not have heterotrophs. We need, as heterotrophic organisms, humans, we need photosynthetic organisms to survive. Whether we're eating plants directly and gaining their energy that way, or if we're eating animals that already ate plants, we're still eventually eating those plants, which again, eventually, all that energy is coming from the sun. So regardless, we always eat sunshine. That's a good way to think about it. Whether it's converted sunshine or unconverted sunshine, in the case of plants, it's still just harvested sunlight energy transformed into sugars or other usable biomolecules that we can consume. But we are heterotrophs, so we rely on autotrophs to survive. Main structures of photosynthesis are really take place in the leaves of the plants, or at least in the photosynthetic parts of plants, mostly in the leaves. Sometimes we have photosynthetic stems and things like that, but primarily when we're thinking about plants, we're going to think about photosynthetic structures in leaves. And what we really need are only a few things. We need sunlight, energy, we need carbon dioxide, which is freely available in the air, and we need water. That and some complex biochemistry, and we have sugars. It's an amazing process. It never ceases to amaze me. I really love talking about it because it's so amazing. So when we have this carbon dioxide, this water, and this energy, we end up with sugar and oxygen. And all of this occurs in these structures within these photosynthetic organisms that are called chloroplasts. Or in the case of some photosynthetic bacteria, it occurs in the cell membrane, but it functions the same as a chloroplast. But we're going to stick with chloroplasts because we're talking about plants. Within these chloroplasts, we have pigments. So these are color molecules. In the case of plants, we're going to be talking about chlorophyll A and B. These are light-absorbing pigments that are driving these chemical reactions. Within the chloroplast, we have these stacks of membrane called thylakoids. Again, when you're going through the reading, look at and understand where these structures are because, again, the physical space matters. These are physical structures within the cell membrane that are doing these biochemical pathways, and so it's important to keep these the physicality of these structures in mind as well. It also helps to build these sort of mental frameworks for how these systems work. They really are structures. They're just very tiny structures. But there are two parts of photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. We're going to first start talking about the light reactions. And when we're going to talk about the light reaction, we have to talk a little bit about light. And the book goes through and talks kind of about light and its wavelengths and things like that, but really it's good to understand that light is energy. And plants are utilizing that energy to drive this system. When we're talking about plants, we're only talking about the visible spectrum of light, and they're utilizing pretty much all of it except for green. That's why plants look green. That green light is reflected off and we see it. They're not using that part. They're using the other parts. So they're absorbing this energy. They're absorbing this sunlight energy on these pigment molecules of chlorophyll. So these chlorophyll molecules are absorbing specific wavelengths of light and putting that energy to use to build their sugars. On these chlorophyll molecules, and you can see these chlorophyll molecules illustrated quite nicely in figure 5.12 in the text, you can see that the light energy from the sun is hitting these chlorophyll molecules and exciting these electrons. We talked about electrons, right, as energy carriers in oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain. Similar sort of idea. In the case of chlorophyll, though, these electrons are being excited by the sun. So this becomes sort of a self-dependent loop, or a self-sustaining loop, rather. These chlorophyll molecules, electrons are being excited by the sun and starting this process of driving this system forward. This is the start of the light-dependent reaction. It requires light, hence the name. With this reaction, we start splitting water molecules into oxygen. The oxygen that we breathe, this is where it comes from. The beginning of these light reactions in photosynthesis. That's where it comes from. The splitting of water into oxygen and hydrogen ions is the first step at the chlorophyll in the light reactions. If we follow this process through, as in figure 5.13, we can see that this first step, exciting these electrons in the first photosystem, or it's actually a photosystem too, but because it was the second one described, but the first step is photosystem 2. It takes this high energy electron and starts moving it through an electron transport chain. Not the same one as we talked about last time, but again, the same concept. It's these physical protein structures embedded in the cell, or in the membrane of these thylakoids, and putting these high energy electrons to work. What are they doing? Again, these tiny little protein pumps are pumping hydrogen ions across a membrane. Another photon of light from the sun hits photosystem 1, re-energizes that electron, and moves it through this system again, and generates NADPH. Again, another high energy molecule, similar to NADH that we saw on the other side. So the electron transport chain associated with photosynthesis is a different electron transport chain as we saw with oxidative phosphorylation, but it's working in much the same way by setting up this chemiosmotic gradient of hydrogen ions, and it pumps again these hydrogen ions. They're not pumped; they diffuse through ATP synthase, again generating ATP. So in the case of photosynthesis, light is being harvested from the sun, energizing high energy electrons in chlorophyll. Those high energy electrons are being put to work through this electron transport chain to pump hydrogen ions. Again, the generation of high energy molecules, and this chemiosmotic gradient drives production of ATP in these cells, rather in the organelles of these cells. So that's the light reactions. Again, they're light reactions because they rely on light to work. If we didn't have light working, these reactions wouldn't go. The next step is taking this ATP and the NADPH from the light reactions and putting them to work in the cells to build these sugars. And this happens with the Calvin cycle. We can see the Calvin cycle linking with the light reactions in figure 5.14. Again, we look at the cycles, these arrows in the figures, and understand that these are enzymatically driven biochemical pathways. For the sake of this class, we don't need to know all the inner workings and the high levels of details, but you can find those if you're interested. They're freely available on the internet. Just Google the Calvin cycle and you'll find all the detail you want. For the sake of this course, this is the level of understanding that you need, that this is an enzymatically driven pathway to build sugars using energy and high energy molecules generated during the light reactions. They go through this process where we take carbon dioxide from the air, freely available, inorganic molecule, carbon dioxide from the air, and these plants are putting the energy that they've built by the light reactions, and they're building these complex molecules from CO2. So they're forming these carbon-carbon bonds using the energy they've built, or they've stored, or converted rather, in the light reactions, and they're taking CO2 from the air and they're building sugars. It's an amazing process. It never ceases to amaze me. So we start with carbon dioxide and we put in some energy and some enzymes, and we run through the Calvin cycle, and we go through these what are called carbon fixation steps, where we're attaching one carbon to the next, and the next, and the next. All of that requires energy and enzymes, and we're getting the energy from that from the light reactions of the photosynthesis. Also, we're gaining energy from these high energy electrons from the NADPH molecules. So ATP and NADPH from the light reactions are driving the Calvin cycle to produce these 3 carbon sugars. Now, these 3 carbon sugars, you may have noticed, are not the same as the 6 carbon sugars of glucose, but they are these precursors that plants then put to use to build different molecules, whether they're building structural components or like say cellulose, or whether they're building starches for energy storage. They're still putting these 3 carbon sugars to use in various ways within their cells. So with photosynthesis, we have light energy being harvested in the light reactions, being converted into chemical energy in the form of ATP as these high energy electrons move through the electron transport chain, pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient. Concentration gradient of hydrogen ions drives ATP synthesis through ATP synthase. The byproducts of the light reactions, the ATP and the NADPH, move over to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle uses those high energy molecules to take CO2 from the air with enzymes and builds complex sugars. Those complex sugars then are utilized by plant cells in their mitochondria to release that energy that's then usable from the plant. That's also usable to organisms that eat those plants. So this is really where the energy systems that are driving life as we see it on the planet forward. It's super critical that you understand that without photosynthesis, the life on this planet would be completely different. The free oxygen that we breathe all comes from photosynthetic organisms. Without photosynthesis, the oxygen would be rapidly used up by just regular sort of chemical pathways, and then we would suffocate. Without photosynthesis, life looks completely different. That being said, when photosynthesis arrived on the planet as an evolutionary path, and we start to have an excess of free oxygen in the air, there's probably a massive extinction event where all of the organisms, the microorganisms that were completely reliant on an anoxic environment, these glycolysis sorts of organisms, they just die because oxygen can be very toxic to many different organisms. So plants are super critical to the structure of the world that we see today. All right, this is the third part. I hope you guys have learned a lot about glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation and photosynthesis. I'll stop talking at you and see you next week.